The cardiac cycle is the steps of the heartbeat. So think about the heartbeat, lub-dub. It happens in two parts, and we've already talked basically about these two parts. First, the atria contract, then the ventricles contract. We're going to break this down into further steps to see exactly what's happening as the heart beats. So our first step here, and really this is a cycle, it's a continuous cycle. There is no beginning, there is no end, but we have to start somewhere. So this isn't technically step one. There is no step one in a continuous cycle. But we are going to start with early diastole. So diastole means that the heart is relaxed. So, and this is early diastole, so it means it's in the beginning of its relaxed period. It just finished a contraction. During this time, you have the arteries. So here is your aorta, and here is the pulmonary trunk. The arteries are full of blood that was just pumped into them. So a fraction of a second ago, you put blood in the arteries. There's a little bit of blood left in the ventricles. No matter how good your ventricles are, they will never pump all of the blood out. Think about your ventricles like a tube of toothpaste. You have that toothpaste in there, and when you get toward the end, there's that little bit in there you just can't get out. No matter how hard you squeeze, no matter what you do, you can't get that last bit of toothpaste out of the tube. That's how your ventricles are. There's always going to be a little bit of blood left. This little bit of blood that is left is called end systolic volume. And we can abbreviate this ESV. Systolic means contract. And this is end systolic. So that means it's what's left after you contract. And we are going to put some numbers to these volumes, and it varies from person to person and based on your activity level. So we're going to do the number that is the average healthy adult at rest. But just remember, these are not precise numbers. They vary greatly. In general, this is going to be 60 milliliters, and that is per ventricle. All of these numbers are per ventricle. So you have 60 milliliters here, and you have 60 milliliters here. That's the leftover blood after the ventricle contracts. Notice also that all valves are closed. So you have your AV valves here and here. We can see the pulmonary semilunar valve. You can't really see the aortic semilunar valve very well. It's kind of tucked up under there. But all four valves are closed right now. So early diastole, the heart has just finished a contraction and now it's relaxing. You have blood in the arteries that you just pumped in there. You have about 60 milliliters of blood left over in each ventricle, which is your end systolic volume. And you have all four valves closed. And notice your atria are filling. So veins are putting blood into the atria right now. So both atria are filling up from the veins. Remember, it's while the heart is resting that it fills with blood. Now we can go to late diastole. The veins are still putting blood into the atria. As the atria fill, that creates pressure that pushes the AV valves open. So in late diastole, the veins continue to fill the atria. And the atria get so full that the pressure pushes the AV valves open. So now that they're open, blood spills into the ventricles. Notice we're not contracting yet though. This is a passive spilling. So once those valves open, blood passively spills into the ventricles. Then we can move on to atrial systole. So here your atria are contracting. See here these little lines represent contraction. You can see it's dented in. So now our atria contract. And remember the conduction system. This is when the signal goes from the SA node to the AV node. And remember the gap junctions? As the signal spreads from the SA to the AV node, the signal spreads through gap junctions to all of the muscle cells of both atria. And the atria contract. They have their systole. When they contract, they finish pushing the blood they have into the ventricles. So now the ventricles are full. And this amount of blood that fills the ventricles is the end diastolic volume. Okay, so end diastolic is the relaxed or the resting phase, and end, so it's after the heart relaxes. So notice diastole is over. It's now contracting. We're in the first phase of the heartbeat where the atria contract. So we're at the end of diastole. So EDV is end diastolic volume. That is your ventricles full. And the average healthy adult at rest has 130 milliliters per ventricle. No, I'm sorry. Yes, 130. Next, we're ready for the ventricles to contract. So now we have the ventricles contract in two stages. So we're going to have early ventricular systole, then late ventricular systole. So now that signal is in the Purkinje fibers. Remember, the signal comes down the septum, it gets to the apex, and then it starts to go up the Purkinje fibers. So the apex of the ventricles contracts. And when they do, they push the blood upward. So the blood is now moving up like this. Well, look at those AV valves. See how the AV valves hang down like this? Well, as the blood moves up, it hits the underside of the AV valves and pushes them closed. Now we go into the late ventricular systole. So the contraction moves up the ventricles. So now the upper part of the ventricles is contracting. And this continues to push the blood up. Now the blood's going up this way toward the semilunar valves. So the AV valves are already closed. So now the blood moves up further toward the semilunar valves. And these valves open upward. So see, here's the semilunar valve closed. When it's closed, it's kind of like this. And when you hit it from the bottom, it pushes it open like this. So the blood hits the bottom of the semilunar valves and pushes them open. And then the blood enters the arteries. And the amount of blood that enters the arteries is the stroke volume. And in general, this is 70 milliliters per ventricle pumped into an artery. So if we look at all these numbers here, we had 3 sets of numbers. We start off, we had our end systolic volume, the blood left over, our end diastolic volume, the ventricle when it's full, and the stroke volume, the blood that it pumps out. So let's look at these 3 numbers. You have 130 here is your end diastolic volume. So that is the ventricle is full. So here is a full ventricle with 130. The ventricle is going to contract and push blood into an artery. So we have our stroke volume. That is 70 milliliters into the pulmonary trunk if it's the right, or the aorta if it's the left. Then you have your 60 milliliters is your end systolic volume. This is the blood left over that didn't make it into an artery. Okay, so you start with 130, you pump 70 into an artery, you have 60 left. So anytime you know two of these numbers, you can figure out the third, because stroke volume plus end systolic volume will equal end diastolic volume. So if you know two, you can figure out the third. The other thing we can do with these numbers is calculate the ejection fraction. The ejection fraction is the percentage of the end diastolic volume, which is, remember, the ventricle when it's full, it's your full starting amount of blood. It's the percentage of that that makes it into an artery. Okay, if you think of the heart again like a tube of toothpaste. Let's say you start off with a brand new full tube of toothpaste and it has 100 milliliters of toothpaste in there. And you squeeze as much of it out. And you get down to the end where you can't squeeze any more out. Let's say you squeezed 80 milliliters of toothpaste out of there and there's 20 milliliters left that you just can't get out. Then your ejection fraction would be 80%. You got 80 out of 100 milliliters of that toothpaste out onto your toothbrush. There's 20 milliliters that you couldn't get, and that would be your end systolic volume. So if we do this for the heart, the ejection fraction is going to be that 70 over 130. You started off with 130, you got 70 into the artery. That comes out to about 54%. A little over half. And the ejection fraction, it varies a lot. So somebody who has a weak heart, like if they have heart disease, they're going to have a low ejection fraction. Somebody who's like an athlete, remember before we talked about how an athlete can have a really low heart rate, like in the 40s, because their heart is so strong and efficient, they're going to have a high fraction. Also think about variations in activity. Think about when you have sympathetic stimulation. You know how your heart pounds when you have a fight or flight reaction? Well, when your heart is pounding like that and contracting more forcefully, you're going to have a higher fraction. So remember, sympathetic makes you have more force in your contraction, and that more force will give you a higher ejection fraction. Here we have an electrocardiogram, which can be called an ECG or EKG for short. Remember when we did that graph comparing the electrical activities of skeletal muscle to cardiac muscle? That's what an EKG shows. It is the electrical activity of the cardiac muscle. So remember we had depolarization, plateau, repolarization. So the muscle cell, and again, if you need to, look back at those two graphs, the side-by-side comparison of the skeletal and cardiac muscle. You depolarize by sodium coming in, and you raise your voltage. Then you have plateau, where you have calcium in and potassium out at the same time. And this gives you kind of a slowly falling voltage. It's pretty steady. Then you have repolarization, where you just have potassium out, so the calcium gate's close, and that decreases your voltage back to your resting membrane potential. Remember, during plateau is when you have systole. Muscle contracts during plateau. And remember that the heartbeat occurs in 2 steps. So you're going to do this twice. First for the atria, second for the ventricles. So this graph is electrodes picking up these activities: depolarization, plateau, repolarization in the cardiac muscle. And I've already color-coded this graph. I color-coded it to match what we have up here in the last set of notes you took, because the electrical activities correspond with the different parts of the cardiac cycle. So we're going to start off. Our first thing up here was early diastole, when the heart is relaxed. So notice that's at the ends. So like here and here are when the heart is in early diastole. So this is when the heart is between beats and it starts to fill with blood. Now this graph repeats. So the reason I have something at the end and again at the beginning is there would be another beginning here. Like we could actually continue this on. This graph just keeps going and repeating. So when you get to the end, you go back to the beginning. So this part here that I have marked as the beginning would be right here. It would come right after the end. So the early diastole is this area between the heartbeats, when the heart's relaxed and it's beginning to fill with blood. Okay. Then we have our late diastole. So that's the purple. So here on the graph, this is the P wave. P wave is the atria depolarize. So remember, depolarization happens before the systole. So just before the atria contract, they have to depolarize. So this is when sodium is entering the myocardial cells of the atria and raising their voltage. That rise in voltage of the atrial cells is what you see as this P wave. And this occurs as the signal moves from the SA node to the AV node. Remember, as the signal's moving from the SA to the AV, it spreads through the gap junctions and depolarizes all of the atrial myocardial cells. Okay, then after you depolarize, the next thing you have is plateau and systole. So that is the atrial systole. This part is called the PQ segment. So the PQ segment shows us the atria in plateau. And this is when they systole. So this is when you have calcium in, potassium out, steady voltage, and they contract. You have atrial systole at this time. And so you push the rest of the blood into the ventricles. Then next, the ventricles have to contract. So I used green here, and we don't have green up here because there's not really a picture here that kind of corresponds with it. So it would just go like right here in between these steps. So this is QRS. So this is called the QRS complex. This is when the ventricles depolarize. So now in the ventricles you have sodium in and voltage going up. Then next you have the ventricle systole. And up here we split it into two parts. We have the yellow for the early and the blue for the late. So this part down here is the ST segment. So you can pick if you want to write that in yellow or write it in blue or half and half. I'll just go ahead and put it in yellow, make it a little easier. But next you have the ST segment. This is when the ventricles are in plateau. So they have calcium in, potassium out, and the voltage is steady, and you have ventricular systole. Okay, then after plateau comes repolarization. So now we have the ventricles repolarize. This is the T wave. So now you have just potassium out and your voltage goes down and the heart is relaxed. So now you are in diastole, where you again begin to refill with blood. And then you would go back to another P wave. So remember, it's a repeating cycle. So then you would have another P wave. So this would be our next P wave right here, and you would just keep repeating. Okay, so we have P wave, the atria depolarize, PQ segment, the atria plateau and systole, QRS complex, the ventricles depolarize, ST segment, the ventricles plateau and systole, T wave, the ventricles repolarize. So we're going through these three steps. We have it once for the atria, a second time for the ventricles. So you might be noticing something missing. If I said we're going through these three steps, so we have atria depolarize at the P wave, plateau at the PQ segment. Then we jump up to the QRS complex with the ventricles depolarizing. We skipped atria repolarizing. There is a reason we skip that. It does happen, but it's not shown here. So atria do repolarize. But they do so at the same time as the ventricles depolarize. So you have two events occurring at the same time. We can't put both on the graph. So we see the QRS that represents the ventricles depolarizing. The atria are repolarizing during this time, but you can't look at two things at the same time. So we look at the ventricles depolarizing. So to kind of sum this up, you have compare it to what we started with here. You have atria depolarize. That's the P wave. Then you have atria plateau. That's the PQ segment. Then we have the ventricles depolarize and the atria repolarize at the same time. That's the QRS. Then we go into the ventricles plateau, then the ventricles repolarize. There's your steps. Now we're going to look more closely at cardiac output and the things that can alter it. So cardiac output is the amount of blood that a single ventricle pumps into an artery in 1 minute. So you have two cardiac outputs. You have the right ventricle pumping into the pulmonary trunk, and you have the left ventricle pumping into the aorta. Ideally, these will be equal to each other. And later we'll talk about what happens if they're not equal to each other. But in a healthy person, these two ventricular cardiac outputs are equal. So let's think about what determines cardiac output. It's the amount of blood the ventricle pumps into an artery. Well, that should sound familiar to you. That is your stroke volume. And in 1 minute, that has to do with your heart rate. So we already know that stroke volume in an average healthy adult at rest is 70 milliliters. We also know that heart rate for an average healthy adult at rest is 75 beats per minute. So if your heart is beating 75 times in a minute, and each time it beats, it pumps 70 milliliters of blood into the artery, we want to know how much blood got pumped into that artery during that minute. It's very simple. Cardiac output is heart rate times stroke volume. You just multiply your heart rate by your stroke volume. So an average healthy adult at rest has cardiac output of 75 times 70. And that comes out to 5,250. This is milliliters per minute. Since this is metric, you can move the decimal. So instead of saying 5,250 milliliters per minute, we're going to move the decimal over and say 5.25 liters per minute. So standard cardiac output is 5.25 liters per minute. And remember, that is per ventricle. So going into the pulmonary trunk, you have 5.25 liters every minute. Also, going into the aorta is 5.25 liters per minute. So here are two things that determine cardiac output. Remember, we have the node and we have the muscle. Node is in charge of heart rate. It controls how fast your heart beats, and you have that cycle. We start at -60. The -60 causes the sodium gates to open, and sodium comes in. Sodium comes in and raises the voltage to -40. This stimulates the calcium gates to open. Calcium comes in, raises the voltage to 0. This stimulates potassium gates to open, and potassium goes out, and your voltage goes back down to -60. Then we have our muscle. It works because you have calcium from your sarcoplasmic reticulum plus calcium that enters through your calcium gates from outside the cell. So you get your total amount of calcium inside the myocardial cell. This binds troponin, which then moves tropomyosin so that you can form cross bridges. More calcium means more cross bridges. The more cross bridges you have, the more force you have. And the harder the heart squeezes, the higher the stroke volume. So you control your stroke volume by controlling how much calcium enters. This one right here is how you alter your stroke volume. So that's the basics of cardiac output. You can change cardiac output by changing your heart rate or stroke volume or both. So now let's start exploring this. Things that are going to affect heart rate and stroke volume, which will then in turn affect cardiac output. Let's take a minute to talk about kids and athletes, because we've said that 75 is the standard heart rate for an average healthy adult at rest, but not everyone is an average healthy adult. So if we think about kids, kids are small. They're smaller than adults. That means their heart is also small. If their heart is small, then their stroke volume is going to be low because you can fit less blood in that ventricle. So a small heart has a lower stroke volume. In order to compensate for this lower stroke volume, you have to have a higher heart rate. Okay, think about if you're filling up a bucket. If we have a bucket and I tell you to put water in the bucket, if you're an adult, here's an adult, and you have to put water in the bucket, and I give you a big, 32-ounce mug. Like you go to the gas station, you get one of those big 32-ounce sodas, and that's what you use to fill the bucket. Let's say we have a kid, and I give the kid just a little 8-ounce. So this, let's say this is a 32-ounce, this is an 8-ounce. And the kid has to fill the bucket, but his cup he's using to pour water in is only 32, or is only 8 ounces. Well, the kid is going to have to do more trips, right? You can walk over to the sink, fill your 32-ounce cup, go dump it in the bucket. You can do that in a few times, and you're going to have the bucket full. The kid is only carrying 8 ounces at a time. So the kid is going to have to make more trips to the sink and back to the bucket in order to get the bucket full. Now let's say that I give you 1 minute. So you have to have this bucket full in 1 minute. Well, you can walk nice and slow, take your time. The kid, however, is going to have to run back and forth really fast in order to get that bucket full in 1 minute. So kids have higher heart rates. For a child, a resting heart rate is in the hundreds. Then if we look at athletes, athletes are the opposite. We've talked about them before with their heart rates in the 40s. Athletes have a strong heart. If you remember last semester when we talked about like oxygen use and going into fermentation, if you're out of shape and you try to run a marathon, you're not going to make it very far. If you train, you will be able to do it. And one of the things that changes when you train is that your heart and lungs get better at sending oxygen to your muscles. That's why you're able to run for a longer period of time. So athletes, because they train, they have a much stronger heart. The force is increased. Athletes have more force every time their heart beats. So because their heart is strong, it has more force. And because they have more force, they have a higher stroke volume. So if we threw an athlete in here with the bucket, here's an athlete, someone who regularly trains and runs marathons. We're going to give the athlete a great big, like a 52 ounce. You know, Casey's has those giant 52 ounce mugs. That's what we're giving the athlete. So he has an even easier time filling up that bucket than the adult or the child. So because athletes have such a high stroke volume, they don't need their heart to beat very fast. So an athlete's resting heart rate can be about 40 to 50. Okay, now let's look at chronotropic agents. So if we break this word down, chronotropic. Chron means time. Think of like chronology. It means putting things in order of time. So chronotropic agents are things that will alter your heart rate. Heart rate is about time. It's beats per minute. So chronotropic agents are going to alter heart rate. That means they are going to do it by acting on your node. The node, remember, is in charge of heart rate. So chronotropic agents are any outside force that's going to stimulate the node and tell it to go faster or slower. Let's go back and review what's going on in the node. You have your nodal cell, and you have that cycle. You start at -60, then you let sodium in. That takes you to -40. Which makes the calcium gates open. You let calcium in. This takes you to 0, which causes the potassium gates to open. Potassium goes out, and you're back to -60. We know that parasympathetic is going to have acetylcholine from the vagus nerve, and that will open potassium gates. So when you have parasympathetic, you have extra potassium out, which gives you then even more negative. You will hyperpolarize, which means that it takes longer for the sodium to get to -40. So parasympathetic is a negative chronotropic agent. Because it decreases your heart rate. Then we have sympathetic. So remember, sympathetic works because your cell has beta receptors. Norepinephrine binds to the beta receptor. That activates C-AMP. C-AMP then opens a calcium gate and lets extra calcium in. So when you have norepinephrine, you get extra calcium in. That means you go this part faster. You go from -40 to 0 faster. So with sympathetic, norepinephrine binds the beta receptor. You activate C-AMP. This opens calcium gates so that you have extra calcium to go from -40 to 0 faster. So you have parasympathetic and sympathetic are your main ones here. So sympathetic is a positive chronotropic agent. Because it increases your heart rate. Okay, then we have other things that can come in and alter this. So if we look at some other chronotropic agents, we're going to have thyroid hormone. So take a minute and go back to chapter 17 and review thyroid hormone. Is it water soluble or lipid soluble? And what are the implications of that? What is it going to make the heart cell do? So thyroid hormone is lipid soluble. And we know that lipid soluble hormones stimulate cells to make protein. Now take a minute, look at your pre-class assignment. What are some examples of proteins on cells? What protein is the thyroid hormone going to make this nodal cell in the heart make? So beta receptors are proteins. Receptors on cells are proteins. So start putting 2 and 2 together. Thyroid hormone is lipid soluble, so it's going to stimulate the cell to make protein. Beta receptor is protein. Thyroid hormone causes the nodes of your heart to have more beta receptors. So they're up-regulating. Remember in chapter 17, cells can change their number of receptors, up-regulate or down-regulate. So thyroid hormone makes your heart up-regulate to norepinephrine. So when you have thyroid hormone, you're going to have more beta receptors. You get all these extra beta receptors here. If you have more beta receptors, you're going to bind more norepinephrine. And for each norepinephrine you bind, you're going to get a C-AMP. And that C-AMP is going to go open more calcium gates. So the result of that is there's going to be more calcium coming into the cell. So more beta receptors means you will bind more norepinephrine, which means you will have more cAMP, which means you will open more calcium gates, and you will let even more calcium in. And that will make you go from -40 to 0 even faster. Another one is caffeine. You may have noticed if you drink a lot of coffee, your heart kind of racing, or like those energy drinks. There have even been people have heart attacks from drinking those energy drinks because they make your heart race so fast. So caffeine speeds up your heart. The way caffeine works is it keeps the cAMP active. So in a normal situation, norepinephrine binds the beta receptor, you get cAMP, cAMP opens the calcium gate, and extra calcium comes in. And then that's it, you're done until the next time norepinephrine binds. Well, if you have caffeine in here, the caffeine tells the cAMP, hey, keep opening calcium gates, don't stop. So if you have caffeine, norepinephrine binds the beta receptor, you activate the cAMP, and then caffeine makes it stay active. So then it keeps letting extra calcium in. We also have nicotine and cocaine. You may have heard that like when people overdose on cocaine, they die of a heart attack because cocaine also makes your heart race. These two both have the effect of increasing your norepinephrine. So they either stimulate your neurons to secrete more norepinephrine, or they're blocking the reuptake of norepinephrine. And if you remember back to chapter 12, we talked about how cocaine blocks the reuptake of norepinephrine. So nicotine, you will secrete more, and cocaine blocks reuptake. So the point is you have more norepinephrine. So that higher level of norepinephrine is going to bind more beta receptors. Okay. Then if we go back and look a little more at negative chronotropic agents, there are things that will slow down your heart besides acetylcholine. But the other negative chronotropic agents act by blocking the effects of norepinephrine. So we do have negative chronotropic that slow the heart rate simply by blocking norepinephrine. Norepinephrine speeds your heart up. If you can stop the norepinephrine from doing that, your heart won't speed up. And if it's not speeding up, then it's slower. It's basically like taking away the gas pedal from your car. You can't speed up your car if you don't have a gas pedal. And you always have some level of norepinephrine in your body. So if you can block norepinephrine, from acting on your heart, then your heart will slow down. This would be the beta blocker drugs and the calcium channel blocker drugs. So these are medications that people take usually to treat high blood pressure. The beta blocker drugs are going to come in and they're going to prevent the norepinephrine from binding to the beta receptor. Then none of this stuff happens. No C-amp, no calcium gates getting open, no extra calcium coming in. The calcium channel blocker drugs act over here. You can still have norepinephrine bind, you can still have C-amp, but they're going to come here and block this so that calcium can't get in. So beta blockers are going to work because they prevent the norepinephrine from binding. So you can still have norepinephrine floating around in your body, but now it can't bind to the receptors. And the calcium channel blocker drugs prevent the calcium from coming in. Then another negative chronotropic agent we have is electrolyte imbalance. And especially potassium. And we're going to learn more about this in chapter 25, but keeping your potassium level at homeostasis is very important, because if your potassium level is off, it can mess up your heartbeat. It can actually even cause your heart to stop beating. So this we'll talk about more in chapter 25 with the electrolytes. Okay, so those are chronotropic agents. This is how you alter your heart rate. Let's keep looking at other factors that would affect cardiac output. So we have venous return and Frank-Starling law of the heart. You have about 5 liters of blood in your body. Remember that from chapter 18. You have 5 liters of blood. When you are resting, you don't actually need all 5 liters. So you use your leg veins as a reservoir to hold blood while you're resting. And that's what this is showing. This is when you're at rest. 64% of your blood is hanging out in the veins, and this is mostly in your legs. So you kind of store that blood in your leg veins. And we'll talk more about this also in chapter 20 when we learn about veins, but that's why you get varicose veins in your legs, because that's where you store blood. And the blood doesn't actually stop flowing. It's just that the veins in your legs when you're at rest will widen so that more blood can be in them, and that blood flows through very slowly. Okay, then when you become active, you do need that blood. So now you've got to get all this blood in these wide veins that's flowing slowly. You got to get it going again. So what you're going to do when you go from resting to active is your muscles squeeze those veins. So you can see here's relaxed, and see how the vein is wide and the muscles aren't pushing on it. Then when you become active, the muscles squeeze that vein. They make the vein narrow. So again, kind of think of a tube of toothpaste. You've got all this blood in your leg veins. When you become active, your muscles squeeze those veins in your legs, and that forces that blood back up to the heart. Now you're putting more blood in the heart. This is increased venous return. So you're going to have more blood entering your right atrium. Remember end diastolic volume, the amount of blood that fills the heart? That number is going to go up now. You're now going to have a higher end diastolic volume. You're filling the blood with more, you're filling the heart with more blood. So now two things happen that you're filling the heart with more blood. On the one hand, stroke volume will increase simply because if you put more blood in there, there's more blood to pump out. Very simple, very straightforward. Don't overthink that part. More blood in gives you more blood to pump out. The other thing that happens is the Frank-Starling law. When you put more blood in the heart, that stretches the heart. So more blood in the heart stretches it. Think of like blowing up a balloon. The more air you put in the balloon, the more you stretch the balloon out. Okay, think of the heart like a rubber band. If you're shooting a rubber band at someone, the more you stretch the rubber band, the harder it's going to spring back. It's like that with your heart. Your heart, like a rubber band, the more you stretch it, the harder it springs back. So by having more blood in there, stretching the heart more, you cause it to increase the force. And if you increase the force, you increase the stroke volume. And that's the Frank-Starling law. It just says that if you put more blood in the heart, you will stretch the heart, which will cause it to contract with more force, which will increase your stroke volume. So increased venous return increases cardiac output by increasing stroke volume. So the increased stroke volume leads to increased cardiac output. And you have the two different ways you're increasing the stroke volume, simply by having more blood in there and by getting the Frank-Starling law where you increase the force of contraction. Now we'll look at inotropic agents. Inotropic agents are outside factors that are going to alter stroke volume. So let's review that heart muscle cell. We know that if this is the muscle cell, we know that we have beta receptors where norepinephrine can bind. it activates C-amp. Remember, this is what the muscle and the node have in common. The C-amp opens calcium gates, extra calcium comes in. But now here's the part where we differ from the nodal cell. That extra calcium gives you more cross bridges. Remember, more calcium's coming in to bind to troponin to move tropomyosin and get more cross bridges. And more cross bridges means more force, and more force means more stroke volume. So let's see what factors can act on this system. So if you remember parasympathetic, remember when we first drew that picture, we had the picture of the nerves going to the heart? The vagus goes to the nodes only. Remember, the vagus does not branch down to the ventricles. So there is no acetylcholine to the muscle cells. So parasympathetic has no effect on force. So parasympathetic does not alter your stroke volume. So remember, we're not going to have any parasympathetic with the stroke volume. Parasympathetic can reduce heart rate. It cannot reduce force. Remember that sympathetic does increase force. Because the norepinephrine combined, you get the C-amp, you get the extra calcium. This is what sympathetic does. So this is the cycle of what norepinephrine does. So sympathetic will make your heart pound. So when it comes to inotropic agents, sympathetic is a positive inotropic agent. So we're going to have sympathetic, the norepinephrine. Because of this whole cycle, it binds to the beta receptor, activates C-amp, lets calcium in, and you get more cross bridges. Okay, another positive inotropic agent is one you already know, the digoxin. Because remember, it traps the calcium inside. The calcium can't get back out. So under normal circumstances, the calcium comes in and then it goes back out. So with each heartbeat, that calcium is constantly moving in and out. But if you have digoxin here, the digoxin blocks the exit. It traps the calcium inside. Remember, it's the Hotel California. So then you get a buildup of calcium. And then this buildup of calcium allows you to have more cross bridges. Okay, then when it comes to negative inotropic agents, remember, we're not going to put parasympathetic here. That's why I did not write this in green. Negative inotropic agents are going to work by blocking the effects of sympathetic. So again, beta blockers and calcium channel blockers. If you want to make the heart have less force, the only thing you can do is take away the gas pedal. Take away the sympathetic stimulation that's making it have more force. So that's how negative inotropic agents work. And also, electrolyte imbalances can be a negative inotropic agent. One more thing we're going to look at here that affects cardiac output is afterload. So remember, your ventricles pump into arteries. And think about taking your pulse. You can feel your pulse. Your pulse is that blood being pumped into your arteries. So arteries have to stretch. You can feel your pulse because you can feel your arteries stretching. So every time a ventricle pumps into an artery, the artery has to stretch to receive the blood. Okay, sometimes people can get artery disease. Like you can have atherosclerosis, you can have plaque buildup, so you can have problems in your arteries that prevent them from receiving the blood. If you look here in this picture, they're showing a little clamp on the artery there. So the heart's trying to pump blood into the artery, but the artery is not receiving it. So the artery could be clogged up, or it can be hardened. You may have heard of like people having hardened arteries. If that's the case, the artery won't receive all of the blood that the ventricle is trying to put in there. So your heart is working really hard and it's trying to maintain this cardiac output and pump the blood in there, but the arteries won't receive it. And that is called afterload, because what this ends up doing is it increases your end systolic volume. There's more blood left in the ventricle after your heart beats because the artery refused to receive that blood. And that higher end systolic volume is the afterload. It's what the arteries refuse to receive. At ventricular balance. This relates to cardiac output. So remember before we said that your right ventricle has a cardiac output into the pulmonary trunk. This blood then ends up going to the lungs to get oxygenated. So this is part of the pulmonary circuit. So here is your right ventricle pumping into the pulmonary trunk. This splits through the pulmonary arteries to go to the lungs. Then we have the left ventricle pumps its cardiac output into the aorta, which then goes out to your body. And we use the word systemic to refer to the whole body. So here's the left ventricle. It pumps into the aorta. That splits here to go to systemic capillaries. The top one represents systemic capillaries above your heart, so your head, your arms. The bottom one represents everything below your heart, your legs, the rest of your body. Remember also we said that ideally these two cardiac outputs are equal to each other. So an average healthy adult at rest, it should be 5.25 liters for the right and 5.25 liters for the left. That is a state of ventricular balance. So ventricular balance means that the cardiac output of the right and the left are equal to each other. So your right cardiac output equals your left cardiac output. And as long as you have ventricular balance, everything goes fine. But not everyone has ventricular balance. You can have problems with your heart in which you no longer have ventricular balance. The problems can be on the right or on the left. If you have damage or weakness, the muscle is weak on the right side of the heart, then it will have a lower cardiac output. It'll have a lower stroke volume and therefore a lower cardiac output. This will cause your right cardiac output to be less than your left cardiac output. So in this scenario, we're saying the left side of the heart is still doing good. It's doing fine. It's the right side of your heart that has a problem, and it has a lower stroke volume. So if the right side of the heart has a lower stroke volume, that means it's going to have a higher end systolic volume. So remember, this is the blood that's left in the heart after it has pumped blood into the artery. Because this side of the heart is having problems, less blood is pumped into the artery. So there is more blood left over in the ventricle after it has pumped. So now, as the veins are trying to fill the heart, there's more blood left there. So there's less room for the veins to put blood in. So the heart is more full after it beats. So this makes it hard for veins to put blood in. If you're leaving more blood in the heart after it pumps, then there's not room for the veins to put very much in. So this means you get kind of a traffic jam. You have all this blood here in the veins waiting to get in. This traffic jam backs up, right? Think about when you've been in a traffic jam. The traffic jam keeps backing up, and it backs up all the way to your systemic capillaries. Well, when you have this traffic jam of blood backed up, that creates pressure. You have more blood in these vessels, and the more blood you have in there, that's creating pressure. So you have pressure here. So this backup of blood creates pressure. And remember in chapter 18 lab, when I came to your lab table with the magnet and the little water molecules, and we talked about how capillaries have holes in them, they're permeable, and that you face a problem of the water wanting to fall out from those holes, but your plasma protein is what saves you? Well, if you get a lot of pressure here, that pressure can push water out, despite your plasma protein trying to hold on to it. So the pressure and the plasma protein kind of get in a tug of war over the water. And this higher pressure is able to push the water out of your capillaries. Even though your plasma protein is trying to hold on to it. The pressure is more powerful. Okay, so under this condition where you have this traffic jam of blood trying to get into the right side of the heart, that creates so much pressure that the pressure becomes more powerful than your plasma protein, and water is pushed out. So you end up with water leaking out of these capillaries. And if you remember from when we talked about this in chapter 18, this is edema. So your body will swell. So you will get edema. And you'll especially see it like in the hands and the feet and the legs. So if you have heart disease or damage on the right side of your heart, you're going to end up with edema out in the body, out in the hands and feet and legs, because of that pressure created by the blood backing up, trying to get into the right side of the heart. Now let's look at the left side. Same concepts here, just in a different place. The left ventricle is pumping into the aorta, which goes out to the body. So let's say if you have damage or weakness on the left, then you're going to have less blood being pumped out into the systemic. So you're going to have a lower stroke volume on the left, and that lower stroke volume means you're going to have a higher end systolic volume on the left. Same idea as we just talked about. If less blood is being pumped out, more blood is left behind in the heart. So now you get a traffic jam of blood trying to get into the left side of the heart. Well, the blood coming into the left side of the heart is coming from the lungs. So now it's here in these pulmonary veins where you have the traffic jam, and you get that buildup, and that buildup goes all the way back to your pulmonary capillaries. And remember, this is going to create pressure, and that pressure is going to cause water to come out. So now we have pressure is going to push water out in the pulmonary capillaries. Well, this is in your lungs. So now, instead of getting edema, you get water in your lungs. The lungs will actually start to fill up with water. Well, if your lungs start to fill with water, you're going to have trouble breathing. You're going to get shortness of breath. Right? You're going to have this very uncomfortable drowning feeling. And so what happens is then people go to the doctor and they complain that they're having trouble breathing. And sometimes you might assume that it's a problem with your lungs. Makes sense. It's a problem with your lungs. You're having trouble breathing. And the doctor does an exam and says, oh, you have congestive heart failure. So sometimes people don't understand all this. They have trouble breathing. They go to the doctor says you have heart failure. And the person's like, no, you're not listening to me. I said it's my lungs that I'm having trouble with. I can't breathe. Well, this is the connection. Congestive heart failure is when you have damage on the left side of your heart. So you get this backup of blood coming from the lungs. That creates pressure in the pulmonary capillaries, which pushes water out, and the lungs start to fill with water, and you have trouble breathing. And if you leave this untreated, you could actually drown from the water filling up in your lungs. So the treatment for this is with diuretics. Like if you may have heard of Lasix. Lasix is a diuretic. It makes you urinate more so that you're pulling that water out. And in extreme cases, they might have to stick a tube down your nose into your lungs and suction the water out. And I actually know somebody who had congestive heart failure so bad that about once a week she had to go to the doctor and they had to stick a tube down and suction the water out of her lungs just so she didn't drown. Well, we have finally made it to the end of chapter 19. Take a minute and celebrate. The longest, most difficult chapter in the book, you're on the last section here. And we're going to end by doing a summary of cardiac output. So we've had a lot of information about cardiac output. What we're going to do here is take all that information and put it together into an organized chart. So remember, cardiac output is heart rate times stroke volume. And it's the amount of blood a ventricle pumps into an artery per minute. So on average, it is 5.25 liters of blood that each ventricle, remember the right and the left have their own cardiac output, pumps into an artery. So that would be the pulmonary trunk for the right and the aorta for the left per minute. And we had a lot of things that alter it. So cardiac output can go up or down. That 5.25 is an average healthy adult at rest. It's not always 5.25. It varies. So we have factors that alter cardiac output. And since cardiac output is heart rate times stroke volume, you alter it by changing the heart rate and or the stroke volume. So really our chart is going to be about things that can affect heart rate and things that can affect stroke volume. So we're going to have cardiac output here at the top. And we'll use two colors here. We'll use a color for things that increase cardiac output and a color for things that decrease. So anything I put in orange is going to be something that will end up increasing cardiac output. Anything I put in blue will be something that will end up decreasing cardiac output. We know that we have heart rate. So on this side, we're going to put heart rate, which remember is controlled by your nodes. It's that cycle of the sodium and the calcium and the potassium. And we know that we have stroke volume, which is controlled by the muscle. It's about how many cross bridges you form. Now we can see with heart rate, remember this is going to be controlled by chronotropic agents. And we can split those into positive or negative. So a positive chronotropic agent is something that will increase cardiac output. Positive chronotropic agents are going to be norepinephrine, because remember it binds to beta receptors, activates cAMP, opens calcium gates. Where calcium comes in, you go from -40 to 0 faster. It's also going to be things that enhance norepinephrine. This would be the thyroid hormone that gives you more beta receptors. So it'd be caffeine that makes the cAMP stay active. It would be nicotine and cocaine because they make you have more norepinephrine. Then we have the negative chronotropic. Negative is things that are going to slow the heart rate. This would be acetylcholine from your parasympathetic and the vagus nerve. This would also be things that block norepinephrine. So remember, it's like taking away the gas pedal. That would be your beta blockers and your calcium channel blockers. Electrolyte imbalance can also slow your heart. Now if we go look at stroke volume, which is how forceful the muscles contract. Stroke volume is affected by afterload. If the arteries refuse to receive the blood, you can't pump as much in there. Stroke volume is affected by venous return. So remember, this is when you become active, your muscles squeeze your veins and force that blood back to the heart. So increased venous return, your veins are returning more blood into the heart because of the muscles squeezing the veins. And then with increased venous return, you also get Frank-Starling law, where because of the extra blood being put into the heart stretches, so it contracts back with more force. Then we have our inotropic agents. So this is like the chronotropic agents, but chron, remember, means time. That acts on heart rate. Inotropic acts on the muscle. And just like the chronotropic, we have positive and negative. So positive, again, is going to be norepinephrine. Remember, the sympathetic nerves branch to both the nodes and the ventricles. So norepinephrine affects both rate and force. This is also going to be your things that enhance norepinephrine. So the thyroid hormone, the caffeine, the nicotine, and cocaine, same list as before. Also on this list, we have digoxin. Remember, that's the drug that's used to treat a weak heart because it traps calcium inside. For negative inotropic, we are not going to put acetylcholine. Remember, the vagus nerve does not branch to the ventricles. So we're going to have here just the things that block norepinephrine. So again, taking away the gas pedal. So things such as your beta blockers, your calcium channel blockers, and also electrolyte imbalance. Electrolyte imbalance does not block norepinephrine. It's its own thing that can affect the force of the heart. So there's a summary of your previous notes kind of put together in an organized way.